There are moments when I wonder how things might have unfolded if I had left behind a simple note. A single sheet of paper resting on the kitchen counter, explaining why I walked away. Would she have read it with trembling hands? Would tears have streaked her face as she realized I had uncovered everything? Or would she have simply crumpled it up, discarding my words just as carelessly as she had tossed aside my trust? But I didn't leave a note. I left nothing. I vanished, slipping away without a single word. It all began with a phone call. An unfamiliar number flashed across my screen. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have answered. I never did. But that night, something deep inside me, an instinct I couldn't shake, made me press accept. First, there was nothing. Just silence stretching on for too long. Then, a slow, deliberate exhale. If I were you, I'd check your wife's messages. Have a good night, buddy. Click. The call ended before I could respond. I stood frozen, the phone still pressed against my ear, my heart pounding hard enough to drown out rational thought. My mind scrambled for an explanation. A wrong number? A cruel joke? Some scammer trying to stir trouble? Yet, despite my efforts to dismiss it, a deep unease settled in my stomach, gnawing at me. Before I even realized what I was doing, my hands were already moving, unlocking Evelyn's laptop on the kitchen counter. Her password hadn't changed. It was still our anniversary, the date that suddenly felt like a cruel joke. The inbox loaded, and with it my entire world shattered. One message, unread, left in plain sight, as if she hadn't even bothered to hide it. Last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. A surge of heat rushed to my head. My ears rang. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. My hand trembled as I scrolled down, my eyes racing over weeks, no months of messages. Wish I could see you again tonight, but my husband is home. Husband, that was me. She spoke about me like I was an obstacle, a barrier standing between her and the man she truly wanted. My vision blurred. My mouth went dry. The steady pounding of my pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. Upstairs, the shower was running. Evelyn was humming, oblivious to the fact that her life was about to change forever. And something inside me shifted. I thought about storming up the stairs, throwing the laptop into the bathroom, demanding answers. I imagined waiting at the kitchen table, the messages open in front of me, letting her witness the exact moment she lost me. But then, a realization struck me. I didn't want an explanation. What could she possibly say to make it better? That it was a mistake? That she loved me but needed something more? That she had planned to tell me eventually? No, I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of guilt, of tears, of pretending she was sorry. So I grabbed my car keys, my wallet, my passport, just the essentials. I walked to the door, hesitated for only a moment, then stepped out into the night. And I never looked back. The darkness enveloped me as I drove away. My headlights cut through the night, but beyond them, everything blurred. It felt surreal, as if I were watching myself from a distance, disconnected from my own body. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was in fragments. I had no plan, no destination, only distance. For the first hour, I drove in silence, allowing the road to stretch between me and the life I had abandoned. Every time Evelyn's messages resurfaced in my thoughts, my grip tightened on the steering wheel, my pulse hammering against my skull. The words replayed in my head like an inescapable melody. Wish I could see you again tonight, but my husband is home. Husband, a title that had lost all meaning in an instant. I wanted to feel rage. I wanted to feel something other than this aching emptiness. But the truth was, I didn't even have the energy for anger. I felt hollow, like I had left behind a part of myself that I would never get back. A green highway sign flashed by, 80 miles to the next city. A name I didn't recognize. It didn't matter. I just kept driving. Around midnight, I pulled into a gas station, the kind that looks the same no matter where you are. Flickering fluorescent lights, a dingy restroom, a cashier who barely looked up from his phone. I filled my tank, walked inside, and grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of gum. As I stood at the register, I caught my reflection in the security mirror above the counter. The man staring back at me looked unfamiliar. Disheveled hair, dark circles under his eyes, a vacant expression. The cashier handed me my change. "You all right, man?" I blinked, forcing a nod. "Yeah, just tired." He didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press. I stepped back into my car and sat there for a long time, staring at my phone. I had turned it off when I left. Now I hesitated. Was she searching for me? Had she even noticed I was gone? Did she care at all? I pressed the power button. The screen lit up. A few missed calls. One from Evelyn. Two from an unknown number. No messages. She had called once. Just once. Then, nothing. Maybe she hadn't even real. Maybe she had still been in the shower when I left, clinging to the illusion that everything was fine. Or perhaps she already knew. Maybe she had noticed the empty space in the closet, the missing bag, and chose not to come after me. Or worse, maybe she was with him. I shut off my phone again and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I wasn't ready to face the reality of it all. I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The road stretched ahead of me, an endless path with no clear destination. For the first time in my life, I had no idea where I was heading. The night slowly gave way to morning, yet I remained on the road, driving without direction. I lost track of how many miles had passed, how many small, unremarkable towns I had driven through, each one blurring into the next, like a dream that refused to end. There was no map, no plan, just one goal: to disappear. At some point, exhaustion crept in. My eyes stung from lack of sleep, my fingers ached from gripping the wheel, and my mind felt sluggish, burdened by the thoughts I was trying to push away. I needed to stop. I pulled off the highway into a rundown motel, the kind of place where no one asks questions. A flickering neon sign barely lit the half-empty parking lot, and the building itself looked like it had been forgotten by time. It was perfect. Stepping out of the car, I stretched my stiff muscles before making my way into the lobby. The stale air carried the scent of old carpet and cigarette smoke. Behind the front desk, a woman lazily flipped through a magazine, barely glancing up as I approached. "I need a room," I said, my voice rough from hours of silence. She slowly chewed her gum, her eyes scanning me. "Just you?" "Yeah." "Cash or card?" "Cash." I had withdrawn everything I could from my account before leaving. No digital trail, no way for Evelyn or anyone else to find me. She slid a key across the counter. "Room 14. Down the hall." I grabbed the key, nodded, and left without another word. The room was exactly what I expected. Peeling wallpaper, a stiff mattress, and an old television that buzzed when turned on. It didn't matter. It wasn't home. Then again, I didn't have a home anymore. I dropped my bag onto the chair and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. The weight of my decision was settling in. I had left. I wasn't going back. Evelyn was probably still asleep in our bed, unaware, or worse, awake and indifferent. I hesitated before reaching for my phone. Against my better judgment, I turned it on. The screen lit up. One missed call. Evelyn. Just one. No messages. No frantic texts. No apologies. That should have told me everything I needed to know. And yet, I sat there, staring at the screen, as if my sheer will could change something. Make her care. Make her regret. But nothing happened. I tossed the phone onto the nightstand, ran a hand over my face, and lay back on the bed. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind refused to shut down, replaying everything. The messages, the unknown number, the moment I walked out, as if I had been programmed to leave. I should have felt anger. I should have felt something. But all that remained was numbness. I had spent years building a life, only to become a stranger in it overnight. And now I was a man without a home, without a name, without a past. A ghost drifting through places no one would remember. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled me from sleep. For a fleeting moment, my mind tricked me into believing I was back home, waking up next to Evelyn as I had so many times before. In that hazy space between dreams and reality, I expected to hear the familiar rustling of sheets, feel the warmth of her body beside mine, maybe even hear her murmuring about needing coffee before she could start the day. But reality settled in quickly. I wasn't home, and I wasn't sure where home was anymore. Blinking up at the ceiling, I took in the dim, flickering light from the cracked blinds. The room still smelled of cheap cleaning supplies and worn-out carpet. Everything was exactly as I had left it, a place meant for people who didn't want to be found. Rolling onto my side, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The battery was nearly dead. I debated turning it on again, but I already knew what I'd find. Nothing. No desperate messages from Evelyn. No calls asking where I had gone. Just that single missed call. One. That was all she had given me. I tossed the phone onto the mattress and sat up, rubbing a hand over my face. My body felt sluggish, still trying to catch up with the reality of what I had done. I needed coffee. Grabbing my wallet, I stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying a faint chill. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over the near-empty parking lot. A few trucks were parked near the entrance, but otherwise, the place felt quiet, detached, like I was moving through a dream. Across the road, a small diner stood, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. A neon sign flickered above the entrance, glowing in faded red letters, Maggie's. The scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as I stepped inside. The diner was nearly deserted. A man wearing a baseball cap sat slouched over the counter, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee. Across the room, a waitress hummed softly to an old country tune playing on the jukebox as she wiped down a table. I chose a seat in the far corner, my back pressed against the wall, an old habit that never faded. A woman, likely in her 50s, approached with a notepad in hand. "Morning, Han. What can I get you?" "Coffee. Black." My voice came out hoarse as if it hadn't been used in a while. She gave a slight nod before studying me for a moment. "You look like you could use a bite to eat, too." I wasn't particularly hungry, but I nodded anyway. "Whatever's good." With a knowing glance, she turned and disappeared into the back. I leaned against the booth, gazing out the window. The highway stretched endlessly, vanishing into the horizon. It led to places unknown, to futures I couldn't yet imagine. I wondered where I would be in a week, a month, a year. Would I still be drifting, running from the shadows of my past? Or would I finally settle down in some forgotten town where no one knew my name? The arrival of my coffee barely registered. The waitress had set it down without a word, and I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, taking a slow sip. It was strong, bitter, grounding. And for the first time since I had left, my mind drifted back to Evelyn. What was she doing at that very moment? Had she woken up and noticed my absence? Had she reached for me in the bed, only to find empty sheets? Did she even care? I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes. The answer was clear. No. If she had cared, she would have called again. She would have texted. She would have tried. Instead, silence. Nothing. The clatter of a plate brought me back. Scrambled eggs, toast, bacon. I toyed with the food, appetite absent. The bell above the door jingled, signaling a new arrival. A man in his mid-40s entered, wearing a worn brown jacket. His tired eyes scanned the room before he chose a seat at the counter. Something about him struck me as familiar, not his face, but the way he carried himself. His shoulders bore a weight, his posture slightly hunched as though the burdens of his past followed him. I knew that look. A man trying to escape something. Maybe himself. Maybe a life that had crumbled overnight, just like mine. Steam curled from my coffee as I stared into it, my thoughts tangled. For the first time, I wondered how many people in this diner were fragments of who they used to be. How many had left behind lives too painful to return to? And how many, like me, had disappeared without a word? I pressed my fingers against my temples. This kind of thinking needed to stop. I had to move forward. If I kept looking back, I'd never break free. Hours slipped away as I remained in that diner, my coffee cooling, my untouched plate of food growing cold. The soft murmur of conversation drifted around me, and I watched as people came and went like waves rolling onto a shore only to recede again. No matter how hard I tried to push Evelyn from my thoughts, she refused to let go. Her betrayal clawed its way back, relentless. I should have been angry. I should have felt that burning rage people always spoke about when they were betrayed. But I didn't. There was nothing inside me except emptiness, like I had been hollowed out, leaving only skin and bones behind. It wasn't until the waitress returned for the third time, refilling my coffee without a word, that I realized how long I had been sitting there. She offered a polite smile but didn't comment, merely glancing at my untouched food before walking away. I pulled out a few bills, leaving them on the table, then pushed myself up, stretching stiff limbs. My body ached from being in the same position for too long. On my way to the restroom, I barely noticed the flickering fluorescent light casting a dull, yellowish glow over the cracked tiles and rust-stained sink. Stepping up to the mirror, I stared at the man before me. I didn't recognize him. Dark circles hung beneath my eyes, my cheeks gaunt. The stubble on my jaw was uneven, neglected, as if I had stopped caring. My shirt was wrinkled, its collar stretched out of shape, and my hair a mess, untouched by a comb for days. This wasn't a man who had been lost for a few days. This was a man who had been lost for years. I turned on the faucet, splashing cold water over my face, hoping it would shock me back into some version of myself I recognized. But the feeling didn't fade. That sinking, crushing realization that I wasn't just lost, I had nothing left to return to. Grabbing a paper towel, I dried my hands, avoiding my own reflection this time. There was no point in looking. I didn't want to see the person Evelyn had turned me into. As I stepped out of the restroom, my gaze instinctively landed on the man at the counter, the one in the brown jacket. He wasn't eating. His fingers tapped restlessly against his coffee mug, his stare distant as if he was lost somewhere deep inside his own mind. I should have ignored him. He was just another stranger, passing through. But something about him struck a chord, something in the way he carried the same burden I did. Before I could stop myself, I walked over and took a seat on the stool beside him. He didn't immediately lift his gaze. Instead, his fingers drummed against the ceramic of his mug as if tracing out a silent melody only he could hear. After a moment, he slowly turned his head toward me. "Rough night?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. He let out a low, humorless chuckle and shook his head. "More like a rough life." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. "How long have you been on the road?" he asked finally, this time really looking at me. His eyes were sharp, yet burdened by exhaustion, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and endured just enough to keep going. "A few days," I admitted. "Not sure where I'm headed." He smirked slightly as he stirred his coffee. "That makes two of us." For a while, silence stretched between us. Just two strangers in a roadside diner, sipping terrible coffee, running from things we weren't brave enough to face. I didn't ask his story, and he didn't ask for mine. Maybe that was the whole point. Some people don't need explanations. Sometimes it's enough just to know you're not the only one drifting without an anchor. Eventually, he finished his coffee, dropped a few bills on the counter, and stood. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too," I replied, watching as he walked out, disappearing into the night. I sat there a little longer, fingers absently tracing the rim of my mug, before finally pulling out my keys. It was time to keep moving. Because staying in one place meant thinking. And thinking meant remembering. And I wasn't ready for that. The road stretched endlessly before me, a worn ribbon of asphalt fading into nothingness. I had been driving for hours since leaving the diner, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, my mind a restless loop of memories I wasn't willing to confront. The air inside the car was thick and stale, pressing against me like a weight. I rolled the window down, hoping the rush of cool air might clear my head, but it did little to help. I kept telling myself I wasn't running. I was just moving. But moving where? That was the real question. The fuel gauge edged closer to empty, forcing me to stop in yet another nameless town that looked just like the last, one main street, a scattering of houses, and a gas station that looked like it had stood there since the 1970s. I pulled into the lot, stepping out to stretch my legs before heading inside. A small bell jingled as I pushed open the door. Behind the counter, an older man gave me a slow, assessing glance before turning his attention back to the small, dust-covered television in the corner. Some local news channel was playing, something about a missing person. I forced myself not to dwell on it. I grabbed a bottle of water and a protein bar, the kind of food you choose when eating isn't about enjoyment, just survival. As I approached the counter, I caught a glimpse of myself in the convex mirror above the register. The same hollow face stared back, unfamiliar yet entirely mine. The cashier, a man who looked like he'd seen his fair share of lost souls, rang up my items in silence. Taking my cash, he slid my change across the counter before finally speaking. "Storm's coming." I blinked and glanced toward the window. The sky had darkened, thick clouds rolling in from the west. "A bad one?" I asked, more out of politeness than concern. He nodded. "Wouldn't go too far if I were you." I considered getting back in the car and pushing through, but something in his voice made me hesitate. A storm wasn't what I needed right now. I was already drowning in my own. "Any motels around here?" The man smirked, like he'd been expecting the question. He gestured toward the road. "Couple miles down. Place called Miller's Rest. Ain't fancy, but it's got a roof." That was enough. I thanked him, grabbed my things, and stepped back outside. As I pulled onto the road, the wind had already picked up, the world around me growing eerily still, the kind of silence that comes before the sky breaks open. Miller's Rest wasn't hard to find. It was exactly what I expected. An old roadside motel with a flickering neon sign. The kind of place where no one asks questions. I parked near the entrance and stepped inside the small lobby. Behind the front desk, a woman glanced up from her book, gave me a once-over, then slid the guest book toward me. "Cash only," she said. I nodded, scribbling a fake name before handing her a few bills. She took them without hesitation and slid a key across the counter. Room 7. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was exactly what I had imagined. Worn carpet, a bed that had seen better days, and a nightstand with an old lamp that flickered weakly when I turned it on. But it had 4 walls, and for now that was enough. I tossed my bag onto the chair and sat at the edge of the bed, rubbing my temples. A year ago I had a home, a wife, a life that made sense. Now I was here. Now I was nowhere. The rain began to fall just as I lay back against the pillows, steady and rhythmic against the window, filling the silence with something softer. For the first time since leaving, I let my eyes close. For the first time, a thought crept into my mind: had I truly vanished, or had I never really existed at all? I awoke to the rhythmic pounding of heavy rain against the window, the wind shrieking through the gaps in the motel's aging walls. The storm had arrived in full force, transforming the night into a restless blur of sound and movement. For a fleeting moment, I forgot where I was. My muscles tensed, expecting to feel the familiar warmth of my bed, to inhale the scent of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, to hear Evelyn's soft, steady breathing beside me. But that life was no longer mine. Slowly, I sat up, running a weary hand over my face. The room was dimly lit, the nightstand lamp flickering as if it was struggling to hold on. A damp, musty smell filled the air, mingling with the stale remnants of cigarette smoke, a scent that clung to places meant for transients, people just passing through. I had no sense of how long I had slept. An hour, maybe 2. But I still felt drained, as if sleep had done nothing but still my body while my mind continued to race in endless circles. My gaze drifted to my bag, where my phone remained untouched. I hadn't turned it on since leaving the gas station. I told myself I wouldn't, that there was nothing left for me to check, no one left to wait for. But the urge gnawed at me, persistent and unshakable. Giving in, I picked up the phone and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated instantly, its brightness cutting through the darkness like a sharp blade. One missed call. From her. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to breathe through it. Just one call. No voicemail. No text. I stared at the screen, silently willing it to ring again. But the silence stretched on. She wasn't searching for me. She wasn't desperate to find me. She had called once and then let me fade away. I placed the phone back down, resisting the sudden urge to hurl it against the wall. What had I expected? That she'd be in a panic? That she'd leave endless messages pleading for me to come back? That she'd realize, too late, that I had been someone worth holding on to? No. She had made her choice the moment she sent those words to someone else. Exhaling sharply, I pushed myself up from the bed and wandered into the small motel bathroom. The mirror above the sink was cracked at one corner, distorting my reflection ever so slightly. I turned on the tap, letting the cold water run over my hands before splashing it onto my face. My grip tightened on the sink as I stared at the man in the mirror, a man I barely recognized. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His gaze was hollow, empty. He looked like someone who had been erased from his own life, someone with nothing left to hold on to. I twisted the faucet off, gripping the edges of the sink as if steadying myself against an invisible weight. I had always believed in fighting for things, for love, for loyalty. I had convinced myself that if 2 people shared something real, they could overcome anything. But I had been wrong. Some things weren't meant to be repaired. Some things weren't worth fighting for. Stepping away from the mirror, I left the bathroom, needing to escape the suffocating confines of the room. The rain had eased, though the wind still howled through the trees, making the motel sign groan in protest. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking. There was no destination in mind, just the simple need to be anywhere but inside those four walls. The town was eerily silent at this hour. The main street lay deserted, illuminated only by a few dim streetlights that cast long shadows over the pavement. The small businesses lining the road were all closed, their signs flickering faintly in the wind. A gas station, a diner, a bar humming with the soft buzz of neon lights. I kept walking, my feet carrying me forward without direction, without thought. At some point, I paused in front of a storefront, catching my own reflection in the glass. The man staring back wasn't the same one who had left home days ago. That man had a routine, purpose, a life that, for all its flaws, had once felt stable, even if it had been built on deception. The man in the glass was someone new, someone who no longer existed in the world he had left behind. I turned away and continued walking, slipping into the quiet, empty streets of a town that had never known my name. The days blurred into weeks. The weeks stretched into months. Before I realized it, an entire year had passed. A year since I had walked out that door without looking back. A year since I had erased myself from the life I once called my own. At first, I considered returning, not to Evelyn, not to the remnants of my old existence, but for some kind of closure. Something to ground me, to keep me from feeling like a ghost drifting through the world. But the longer I stayed away, the clearer it became that there was nothing left to return to. I became a shadow, moving from town to town, never lingering too long in one place. I worked whatever jobs I could find, bartending, manning gas station counters, even taking up construction for a time. It didn't matter what the work was, so long as it kept my hands busy and my mind from wandering too far. And then, on a night like any other, in a town that was just another dot on the map, she found me. I was tending the bar in a quiet, dimly lit space, methodically polishing a glass when the soft chime of the door broke the stillness. Instinctively, I looked up, ready to offer the usual greeting. But the words never came. She stood there, Evelyn. Her appearance had changed. Her hair, once familiar, was now shorter, framing a face that seemed more hollow, more worn. There was a frailty to her I hadn't seen before, and yet it was undeniably her. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something heavy. Then, hesitantly, she stepped forward, her hands trembling at her sides. She swallowed hard before speaking. "I've been looking for you." I let out a slow breath through my nose, setting the glass down carefully. "Didn't look very hard." The words hit her, and she flinched. But then, for the briefest moment, something flickered across her face. Something raw, unexpected. Regret. Real, undeniable regret. "I messed up," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know that." She exhaled sharply, gripping the back of the nearest chair as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. "I've spent the past year thinking about what I did, about how I ruined everything. And now, being here, I don't even know what I was hoping for." Leaning against the counter, I folded my arms across my chest. "And," she hesitated, her throat working around the words, "I thought maybe you'd still care." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Did I care? Maybe once. Maybe in a different lifetime, in another version of myself, I would have. Perhaps if she had found me sooner, if she had tried harder, if she had fought for me the way I once would have fought for her, things might have turned out differently. But that version of me, the man who would have stayed, who would have clung to hope, he didn't exist anymore. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my jaw. "You know, for the longest time, I waited for you to call, to explain, to apologize, to do something, but you never did. You let me go. And now, after an entire year, you just show up here and expect what? That I'll just forget." Tears gathered in her eyes, her composure slipping. "I don't expect anything," she said softly. I just needed to see you." I studied her for a moment. The way her shoulders shook, the way she hugged herself like she was trying to keep from falling apart. Once, I would have closed the space between us. Once, I would have pulled her into my arms and told her that we could fix this. But that was a long time ago. I nodded, slow and deliberate. Well, now you've seen me. Her face crumpled, and a shaky breath escaped her lips. She nodded, too, as though reality had finally settled in. The man she had once known was gone, and whatever had existed between us, it was beyond repair. Taking a step back, she wiped at her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I nodded once more. "Me too." And that was it. Without another word, she turned and walked out, disappearing into the night, just as I had a year ago. I let out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding, my gaze lingering on the door long after she had gone. And then, finally, I turned away, because the past was no longer mine to carry, and neither was she.